Hi, my name is Kapil Thungavelu. I'm the creator and lead maintainer for Cloud Custodian. I thought it'd be great to take an opportunity to see what Cloud Custodian looks like underneath the hood. So you've got a set of policies, they're beautiful, you want to go execute them across your environment. Well, you start off by running the CLI. Now, inside of policy execution, we've got a couple different pieces. We've got the outputs, which represent how we're going to send data about the policy execution out to various native syncs, and those are all controlled via CLI flags. Next, we've got the sources, which represent how we're going to query the resources that the policy itself is going to evaluate. And finally, we have the different execution modes. These govern how the policy is going to behave when we run it on the CLI, and also what's going to trigger that policy to execute in the future. So let's take sources as a starting point. Sources represent the different ways of querying outputs, querying resources from the provider. The default way that is most commonly used is what's known as the query or describe source. This is simply going to query the corresponding service for a given resource type to ask, hey, what do you have in this environment? For each of the cloud providers, we also support what's a secondary source that knows how to query the cloud provider's native asset inventory with regards to the resources. So that's AWS config or Azure Resource Graph or GCP Cloud Asset Inventory. And some reasons you might want to use those are sometimes it's useful to be able to query really large environments or environments where you don't necessarily want to put the load on the native services describe output. Now, when we look at Custodian's output storages, we've got really rich native integration for all the cloud providers. And this operates as an abstraction, such that when you run Custodian in a given cloud provider, it always feels like a native application. In GCP, it's going to use Google Cloud Storage. In AWS, it's going to use CloudWatch Logs and CloudWatch Metrics. In Azure, it'll use application insights and monitoring. And so these represent your ability to store the execution outputs into the provider's native storage and use best practices around that. So version your blob store and treat that as your audit log of policy execution. Now, when we come to execution modes, we have two major classes of them. We have what's called the pull-based execution, where a policy is really just going to execute along the CLI. When the CLI is done, that's because the policy is done executing. Then we have what's called the event-based execution modes. Now, the event-based execution modes, when you run them on the CLI, what the CLI is actually going to do is provision the serverless infrastructure in the different cloud environments and hook up the appropriate event sources for them. So it'll actually, and in this case, I represented a few key different event sources that I think are important, but Custodian supports many different execution modes across lots of different event sources that aren't represented here. But the common core capability that I think is the most important to understanding Custodian's ability to help you in your environment is this notion of, on top of the API audit trails for the different cloud providers, being able to attach a policy that can introspect what did that API call change. Is my environment still compliant with my policy, and be able to do that effectively in real time. And so that real-time enforcement and detection really comes from this capability of Cloud Custodian. So that means firing on AWS's CloudTrail, GCP Audit Log, or an Azure Resource Group events. So I hope that gives you an understanding of how a Cloud Custodian policy executes and how that might help you as you figure out how to use it best in your environment. For more information, check out the project's homepage at cloudcustodian.io.